In the autumn of 1998, a factory door in Mitcham closed for the final time. The assembly lines went quiet. The soldering irons cooled. The cabinet makers packed their tools. The last workers walked away from the industrial estate in South London. Soon after, the badge that had once defined absolute broadcast truth appeared on cheap, plastic home cinema systems sold halfway across the world. A decade earlier, that same name had meant precisely the opposite. The Rogers badge was not merely a commercial trademark, it was a gold standard. It was the trusted voice of the British Broadcasting Corporation. It was the absolute acoustic reference for recording engineers, specialist hi-fi dealers, and serious listeners in British sitting rooms. But the real story of Rogers in Britain is not simply the closure of a London factory. It is the story of corporate consolidation and brand dilution. It is the tragedy of overseas ownership, high domestic manufacturing costs, and a global retail market that praised absolute fidelity, but ultimately rewarded mass-market convenience. Britain built the rooms. Engineers built the sound. Every week we tell the stories of British loudspeakers, hi-fi brands and listening rooms that once shaped how people heard music, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in London in 1947. The story of Rogers did not begin with a loudspeaker. It began, like much of the British high-fidelity industry, in the austere but fiercely inventive years following the Second World War. In 1947, in Hampstead, London, an engineer named Jim Rogers founded Rogers Developments. At the time, the company had little interest in acoustic cabinets or driver surrounds. Rogers was an electronics man. He built heavy, carefully wired valve amplifiers. He built radio tuners. He built the equipment that took a faint electrical signal and made it strong enough to move air. In the late 1940s and 1950s, the British audio market was fundamentally divided. On one side was the domestic sitting room, dominated by large resonant radiograms that produced a warm, indistinct rumble. On the other side was the professional recording studio, which relied on massive horn-loaded cabinets and wardrobe-sized enclosures to deliver dynamic range. But as the 1960s approached, and as stereo records began to demand more precise imaging, the British listening environment began to change. Listeners wanted fidelity, but they did not all have the space for a massive corner horn. Yet, the most critical absence in the British audio landscape was not found in the domestic sitting room. It was found in the tight, utilitarian confines of the British Broadcasting Corporation. By the late 1960s, the BBC was expanding its outside broadcast operations. Technicians were sent to cover political conferences, sporting events, local festivals, and royal tours. They worked inside mobile control rooms, cramped, poorly lit vans parked in rain-slicked alleys across Britain. In these tiny acoustic spaces, the BBC engineers faced a severe problem. They needed to monitor the human voice with absolute accuracy to ensure broadcast standards were met. They needed to hear if a microphone was placed incorrectly, or if a presenter was standing off-axis. The existing monitors were simply too large to fit above a mixing desk in a transit van. The smaller commercial loudspeakers available on the high street were entirely inadequate. They colored the mid-range. They exaggerated the bass to sound impressive in a retail shop. They lied to the engineers. The British broadcast system lacked a miniature loudspeaker that told the unvarnished truth. The solution was not found on a retail shelf. It was engineered at Kingswood Warren, the legendary BBC Research and Development Facility in Surrey. There, engineers had been experimenting with acoustic scaling and new driver materials, replacing old paper cones with Bechstein, a plasticized material that offered far lower coloration, provided it was heavily treated and controlled by a complex crossover network. They designed a tiny monitor initially called the LS-3/5, built strictly for near-field listening in those cramped vans. When KEF, the Maidstone-based driver manufacturer, altered the specification of the required B110 bass driver and T27 tweeter, the BBC engineers were forced to redesign the crossover. The resulting loudspeaker was named the LS-3/5A. The BBC, however, was a broadcaster, not a mass-market manufacturer. They could build prototypes, but they could not build the thousands of pairs required for their own regional studios, let alone supply the global demand that would soon follow. They needed commercial partners who could build the speaker under a strict, unforgiving license. This was the specific British entry point for Rogers, though the path was nearly destroyed by financial ruin. By 1975, Jim Rogers' original company had collapsed under financial pressure. The firm went into receivership, but the engineering pedigree of the Rogers name was too valuable to disappear. A company named Swistone, led by the shrewd audio executive Michael O'Brien, purchased the Rogers brand. Operations were consolidated at a new factory located at 310 Commonside East in Mitcham, Surrey. Under Swistone, Rogers applied for and won the license to manufacture the BBC LS-3/5A. The first production models rolled out of the Mitcham factory in 1975. The exact purchase price for an early pair of Rogers LS-3/5A monitors hovered around £60 to £70 in the mid-1970s. In the context of the era, this was not a casual purchase. The average weekly wage in Britain at the time was roughly £35. A buyer was surrendering 2 weeks of labor for a pair of loudspeaker cabinets no larger than a shoebox, possessing no deep bass, and boasting a remarkably low sensitivity. Yet the early British reception was a revelation. The Rogers LS-3/5A was distributed to specialist hi-fi dealers across the country. Shops with dedicated listening rooms began to demonstrate these tiny cabinets alongside massive floor-standing domestic speakers. Customers sat in the demonstration chairs, looked at the small wooden boxes, and assumed they were listening to a much larger system. When the leading British hi-fi magazines, including Hi-Fi News and Gramophone, reviewed the Rogers LS-3/5A, they did not praise its ability to play loudly or shake the floor. They praised its astonishing stereo image. They praised its peerless vocal reproduction. They praised its ability to make a singer sound as though they were physically standing in the room. The manufacturing process at the Mitcham factory was painstakingly slow, because the BBC license demanded that any pair of LS-3/5A monitors could be swapped with any other pair in the field without altering the sound. The tolerances were incredibly tight. Workers at Commonside East had to measure every single KEF driver. They had to match the left and right speakers perfectly. If a driver fell out of specification, it was rejected. The crossovers, populated with large, high-tolerance components, were soldered by hand. The cabinets, constructed from carefully damped birch ply and lined with specific acoustic material, were built to resonate in a highly controlled manner. This dedication to broadcast standards transformed the British domestic hi-fi market. Specialist dealers like Audio T in London and various independent shops in the home counties used the Rogers monitor as the ultimate test for source equipment. Because the speaker was so ruthlessly revealing of the signal fed into it, dealers used it to demonstrate the superiority of high-quality turntables and amplifiers. It became a crucial tool for the British hi-fi trade. Almost immediately, the Rogers factory in Mitcham struggled to meet demand. The BBC purchased massive quantities for their own control rooms. Independent recording studios in London adopted them as near-field monitors. Specialist retailers struggled to keep them in stock. The Rogers badge, previously associated with solid but unassuming amplifiers, was now inextricably linked to the highest standard of British acoustic engineering. The room did not care about the size of the cabinet. The record did not care about the price. The loudspeaker either disappeared into the music or it did not. And in the late 1970s, the Rogers LS3/5A disappeared more completely than almost anything else on the market. By 1977, the Rogers LS3/5A was no longer merely a broadcast tool restricted to the BBC. It had become the absolute center of the British domestic audio conversation. A hi-fi enthusiast from that era and a vintage collector today would understand immediately why this happened. To grasp the significance of the Rogers breakthrough, one must look at the physical object exactly as a British listener would have encountered it in a specialist demonstration room. The cabinet was unassuming, measuring just over 30 centimeters tall. It was finished in real wood veneer, a thin layer of attractive wood used on the outside of a loudspeaker cabinet. Covering the front was a heavy black Tigan cloth grille. When the dealer carefully removed that grille, the engineering was revealed. At the top sat the KEF T27 tweeter, a small driver designed to reproduce high frequencies such as cymbals, strings, and fine vocal detail. It was protected by a distinctive perforated metal dome, designed originally to prevent damage from clumsy hands in cramped broadcast vans. Below it sat the KEF B110 bass driver, a larger driver designed to reproduce low frequencies such as bass guitar, drums, and organ notes. This driver was housed in a sealed box, a closed loudspeaker cabinet that uses trapped air behind the bass driver to control its movement. Unlike many commercial designs that used a port, an opening in a loudspeaker cabinet that uses moving air to reinforce bass output, the Rogers monitor relied on the sealed alignment to maintain absolute control over the cone. The result was a bass response that did not go extremely deep, but rolled off with perfect naturalness, entirely avoiding the artificially bloated bass that plagued cheaper high-street audio. But the true secret of the Rogers breakthrough was hidden behind the drivers. It was the crossover, an electrical network inside a loudspeaker that sends bass, mid-range, and treble to the drivers designed to handle them. The BBC specification demanded a crossover of staggering complexity. Where a budget high-street speaker might use 2 or 3 cheap components to separate the frequencies, the original 15-ohm Rogers crossover used a massive, heavy board packed with precise inductors, capacitors, and resistors. This network was designed to actively equalize the drivers, taming a known resonance in the B110's Beckstrien cone and ensuring the vital mid-range driver, a driver designed to reproduce the middle frequencies where most voices and instruments live, remained brutally honest. This meticulous equalization achieved an astonishingly flat frequency response. How evenly a loudspeaker reproduces low, middle, and high sounds. It also presented a very high impedance, the electrical load a loudspeaker presents to an amplifier, of 15 ohms. This made the loudspeaker relatively easy for valve amplifiers and early solid-state British amplifiers to drive, despite its notoriously low sensitivity. How loud a loudspeaker plays from 1 watt of power measured at a set distance. In a typical British sitting room, where thick carpets, heavy curtains, and bulky furniture heavily influenced room acoustics, the way walls, floor, ceiling, and furniture change the sound after it leaves the loudspeaker, the Rogers monitor performed a magic trick. Because it was designed for near-field listening, the listener heard mostly the direct sound that travels straight from the loudspeaker to the listener rather than the reflected sound that bounces off walls, floor, or ceiling before reaching the listener. The result was a miraculous stereo image, the illusion that sounds come from places between and around 2 loudspeakers. When set up correctly on heavy, rigid steel stands in a British hi-fi shop, the small cabinets seemed to vanish. The singer appeared to stand precisely in the center of the room. The soundstage, the perceived width, depth, and placement of music created by a stereo system, extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the wooden boxes. The distribution breakthrough for Rogers did not happen in mass-market department stores. It happened through a highly committed network of specialist retailers. In London, shops like Graham's Hi-Fi in Islington, Subjective Audio in Camden, and the renowned Unilet Sound and Vision in New Malden championed the speaker. Outside the capital, revered dealers like Spalding's in Croydon and independent shops across the home counties used the Rogers monitor to demonstrate the philosophy that the source component mattered most. If a customer wanted to hear exactly what a premium British turntable was extracting from a vinyl record, the Rogers monitor was the ultimate window. The cost of this truth was significant. Placed alongside a solid-state integrated amplifier and a high-quality turntable, a complete hi-fi system built around the Rogers LS 3/5A could easily cost the equivalent of 2 months' wages for a typical British worker in the late 1970s. But the market responded. The speaker was adopted not just by domestic listeners, but by professional institutions across the country. The BBC Outside Broadcast Department relied on them daily. The legendary Maida Vale studios used them for critical monitoring. Independent commercial recording studios in Soho installed them to check the final vocal mix. The reviewers at What Hi-Fi, Hi-Fi News, and Gramophone magazines used them as absolute reference points to judge other equipment. What competitors could not easily copy was the British moat that Rogers had built. Other companies could buy the same KEF drivers, but they could not easily replicate the strict BBC manufacturing license. They could not easily afford to discard drivers that failed to meet the incredibly tight acoustic tolerances. They could not match the meticulous hand soldering and testing that occurred daily at the Mitcham factory. Rogers had captured the ultimate broadcast prestige and translated it directly into the domestic listening room. The badge on the grille was not decoration. It was a promise about sound. By the early 1980s, Rogers was no longer merely a surviving brand rescued from receivership. It was a British audio empire operating at the absolute peak of its power and influence. The name had become completely synonymous with an acoustic doctrine that valued absolute truth above all other commercial metrics. To understand the sheer scale of this achievement, one must map the British listening ecosystem that made the Mitcham factory the center of the broadcast and domestic audio world. The Mitcham factory in Surrey built the cabinets and matched the drivers. Broadcasting House in central London set the unforgiving broadcast standard. Maida Vale Studios relied on the acoustic truth to monitor complex live orchestral recordings. The BBC outside broadcast fleet carried the small monitors in cramped vans to every royal wedding, political summit, and major sporting event across the country. Graham's Hi-Fi in Islington demonstrated the magic to demanding London audiophiles. Spalding's in Croydon supplied the rapidly growing enthusiast market in the southern suburbs. The critical listening rooms at Hi-Fi News magazine measured the frequency response and repeatedly confirmed the legend. British sitting rooms made the promise real. The scale of production at the Commonside East facility was remarkable not just for its volume, but for the relentless precision required to maintain the BBC license. Every single unit had to perform exactly like the reference model held by the British Broadcasting Corporation. The testing procedures were exhaustive. If a pair of speakers did not measure within a fraction of a decibel of the BBC reference curve, they were not shipped. This ruthless quality control meant that a recording engineer could take a Rogers monitor from a studio in Manchester, swap it with a monitor from a mobile van in Cardiff, and hear absolutely no difference in the tonal balance of a newsreader's voice. But Swissstone did not restrict the Rogers empire to a single miniature monitor. Sensing the immense trust the British public placed in the BBC engineering philosophy, the company expanded its product lines to dominate different acoustic spaces. They became the primary licensed manufacturer for the massive BBC LS 5/8, a large, highly powerful studio monitor used in main control rooms and professional recording environments. They built the LS 5/9, a medium-sized broadcast monitor designed to offer absolute BBC accuracy, but with significantly greater volume capability than the tiny LS 3/5A. Crucially, Rogers also translated this broadcast technology into brilliant domestic high-fidelity products. They launched the Rogers Studio One, a substantial multi-driver loudspeaker that brought professional dynamics and astonishing transparency into larger British homes. They introduced the export monitor and later the LS7 and LS3. These were not cheap mass-market boxes. They were premium, heavyweight cabinets built with the exact same Bechstein and polypropylene driver technologies that the professional models utilized. During this golden era, the Rogers dealer network expanded rapidly. The brand secured prominent listings in high-end audio catalogs and became a cornerstone of the British specialist hi-fi retail experience. A shop that did not carry Rogers was often viewed with suspicion by serious enthusiasts. The company's export presence exploded, with vast quantities of loudspeakers shipped to Europe, North America, and particularly Japan, where an intense, almost religious collector culture began to form around the Rogers interpretation of the BBC monitor. By the mid-1980s, peak annual production at the Mitcham factory was running at maximum capacity. Dozens of skilled workers, cabinet makers, and acoustic engineers were employed to meet the insatiable global and domestic demand. The catalog expanded. The review visibility was total. Rogers had successfully bridged the deepest divide in audio. They were universally trusted by the engineers who made the records and universally desired by the people who bought them. The defining British cultural moment for Rogers was not a single product launch, but a fundamental shift in how the British public learned to listen during the late 1970s and early 1980s. This was the era of the specialist dealer demonstration, driven by passionate hi-fi magazines and a deeply serious approach to sitting room audio. Customers no longer walked into a high-street electrical shop simply to buy a pre-packaged music center based on a glossy brochure. They booked appointments in dedicated listening rooms. They brought their own vinyl records. They sat in silence, and they listened for the truth. When a dealer at a shop like Unilet Sound and Vision in New Malden switched the amplifier output from a large, booming, mass-market floor-standing speaker to the tiny Rogers LS 3/5A, the customer almost always experienced a moment of cognitive dissonance. The visual evidence of the small wooden box contradicted the immense, three-dimensional acoustic image filling the room. In a typical British sitting room, where two cheap high-street boxes could make a vinyl record sound flat, muddled, and distant, the right loudspeaker could make the singer appear exactly between the cabinets, close enough and real enough for the listener to believe the room had fundamentally changed shape. The British response to this capability was absolute devotion. Rogers became a default recommendation for anyone building a serious, high-fidelity system. Waitlists formed at specialist dealers. The Mitcham factory grew to accommodate the relentless demand, expanding its cabinet-making operations and refining its crossover assembly lines. The brand achieved an almost mythical status, not through aggressive marketing campaigns, but through the quiet, unassailable endorsement of the broadcast professionals who used the tools every single day. At its absolute British peak, the physical presence of a Rogers loudspeaker was a statement of profound engineering intent. In a dimly lit BBC control room, a pair of LS5/9 or LS3/5A monitors sat directly above the mixing console, their black Tigan grills hiding the drivers, working 10-hour shifts to ensure national broadcasts sounded flawless. In a commercial recording studio in Soho, the larger Rogers Studio One cabinets stood on heavy plinths, revealing the finest details of a master tape. But the most important landscape was the British home. In a modest sitting room or a dedicated listening room, the Rogers LS3/5A sat majestically on rigid, heavy steel stands made by companies like Target or Foundation. The stands were often filled with sand to kill unwanted resonances. The speakers were wired to a high-quality British integrated amplifier, perhaps an A&R Cambridge A60, a Naim Knight, or a classic Quad 33 preamplifier and 303 power amplifier combination. At the top of the hi-fi rack sat a premium turntable, usually a Lynn Sondek LP12 or a Rega Planer 3. The walnut or teak wood veneer glowed under the domestic lighting. The black cloth grille remained firmly attached. The small square Rogers badge sat proudly near the bottom edge. The physical object was discreet, tasteful, and perfectly aligned with a mid-century British design sensibility that valued understatement over visual drama. It was not built to look impressive. It was built to disappear. The peak metrics of the Rogers empire under Swisstone were staggering for a specialist acoustic manufacturer. Over its lifespan, the global production of the LS3/5A across all licensed manufacturers approached 100,000 pairs. However, Rogers was by far the most prolific and successful of all the licensees. The Mitcham factory alone produced an estimated 43,000 to 50,000 pairs of the LS3/5A, dominating the production history of the most famous small loudspeaker in the world. During the 1980s, the company exported tens of thousands of units globally, anchoring the reputation of British hi-fi in Europe, America, and especially Asia. The factory floor was a hive of skilled domestic labor, employing dedicated cabinet makers, crossover technicians, and quality control engineers who spent their days measuring and matching KEF drivers. Rogers boasted peak catalog presence across the entire specialist retail sector, peak review visibility in every major audio publication, and peak cultural reach. The badge meant uncompromising British manufacturing. It meant BBC approval. It meant the absolute truth. The company had mastered the delicate balance between professional broadcast rigidity and domestic commercial success. But the British audio market is not static. It is a harsh, unsentimental arena. And as the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the forces that built the Rogers empire began to turn against it. The decline of Rogers was not caused by a sudden loss of engineering talent, nor was it the result of a single disastrous product. The collapse of the greatest broadcast-derived loudspeaker empire in Britain was a slow, systematic dismantling. It was the result of a domestic audio market that fundamentally changed its priorities during the 1990s, triggering a sequence of structural forces that no amount of acoustic truth could overcome. The first crack in the foundation was Force 1, British cabinet, driver, labor, and manufacturing costs. Building a loudspeaker to the uncompromising standards of the British Broadcasting Corporation was an incredibly expensive endeavor. The Rogers LS3/5A and its larger siblings could not be assembled quickly by automated machinery. They required high-quality birch plywood. They required expensive real wood veneers. They required complex, heavy crossover networks packed with premium capacitors and inductors that had to be soldered and measured by hand. More crucially, Rogers relied entirely on KEF in Maidstone to supply the B110 bass driver and the T27 tweeter. By the late 1980s, producing these specific drivers to the incredibly tight tolerances required by the BBC license was becoming increasingly difficult and expensive. The rejection rate for drivers that fell out of specification was punishing. Although the BBC eventually allowed a redesign of the crossover in 1987, changing the speaker's nominal impedance from 15 ohms to 11 ohms to accommodate a more consistent version of the KEF driver, the fundamental economic reality remained unchanged. Paying skilled British workers in a South London factory to meticulously measure, match, and test every single component was a business model from a previous era. It was a model that squeezed profit margins to the absolute breaking point. This economic pressure collided directly with Force 5, technological, retail, and listening culture shift. In the 1970s and 1980s, the stereo system was the undisputed centerpiece of domestic entertainment. British listeners sat exactly between two cabinets and focused purely on a vinyl record or a cassette tape. But by the early 1990s, the listening culture began to fracture. The compact disc had fully conquered the market, bringing a demand for louder, punchier, more aggressive loudspeakers. Furthermore, the television began to command the sitting room. The era of the dedicated two-channel hi-fi system was being disrupted by the arrival of home cinema, a multi-channel audio format that required 5 or more speakers and a dedicated subwoofer to reproduce film soundtracks. The new British home cinema buyer did not necessarily care about absolute vocal accuracy or a perfect stereo image. They cared about explosive bass, cinematic surround effects, and visual discretion. They wanted small, cheap, easily hidden satellite speakers. Rogers, a company structured entirely around building relentlessly accurate wooden cabinets for serious stereo listening, found itself structurally misaligned with the new domestic reality. As the market shifted, so did the retail landscape. This introduced Force 2, specialist dealers, hi-fi press, and online price pressure. For decades, Rogers had relied on a dedicated network of specialist hi-fi dealers to demonstrate the superiority of their products. A shop like Graham's Hi-Fi or Spalding's could take the time to explain why a small Rogers monitor cost twice as much as a much larger speaker from a high-street discount chain. But in the 1990s, the high street began to dominate. Giant electrical retailers focused heavily on box shifting, aggressively pushing cheaper, imported brands. Discount audio chains prioritized volume and price over dedicated listening room demonstrations. The specialist dealer network, the vital lifeblood that explained and sold the Rogers philosophy, began to shrink. The loudspeaker did not only have to sound perfect, it now had to survive a noisy, price-driven retail floor where nuance was entirely lost. This deep, structural vulnerability led directly to the British turning point. It was triggered by Force 4, corporate consolidation, overseas ownership, and brand dilution. By 1993, the financial pressures of operating a highly specialized manufacturing facility in Mitcham were insurmountable for a fiercely independent British company. Swistone, the parent company that had rescued Rogers in 1975 and guided it through its golden era, made a fateful decision. The Rogers brand, along with the Mitcham manufacturing facility and its prestigious BBC heritage, was sold to the Wo Ki Hong Group, a large corporate conglomerate based in Hong Kong. The sale was not an immediate death sentence for the British factory. In fact, for a brief period, the Mitcham facility continued to operate. The new overseas owners understood the prestige of the Made in Britain badge and the enduring reverence for the BBC license, particularly in the lucrative Asian export markets. They continued to fund the production of the classic LS lines, and even introduced new domestic models designed by talented British engineers. But the underlying reality had changed completely. Rogers was no longer an independent British audio company driven primarily by acoustic philosophy. It was an intellectual property asset sitting on the balance sheet of an overseas corporation. The decisions governing its future were no longer made by men listening to prototype crossovers in a Surrey laboratory. They were made by corporate executives navigating global supply chains, profit margins, and mass-market retail logic. The brand had been bought. The badge remained. But the listening culture that had necessitated the creation of the company was quietly slipping away. The final collapse of the British manufacturing operation was now merely a matter of time. The BBC itself, the institution that had given Rogers its entire reason for existing, was undergoing a massive technological and structural transition. By the late 1990s, the broadcast industry began to abandon traditional passive monitors that required external power amplifiers. The professional world moved rapidly toward active studio monitors, loudspeakers with built-in amplification, and active crossovers tailored perfectly to the specific drivers. British companies like ATC and PMC, alongside international brands like Genelec, began to dominate the new professional landscape. At the same time, the BBC steadily dismantled its traditional internal R&D structures. They no longer needed to commission thousands of small, passive wooden boxes from a licensed factory in Surrey. The professional anchor that had held the Rogers empire steady simply detached and floated away. In the British sitting room, the situation was equally devastating. Rogers faced brutal competitive displacement from Force 3, imports, budget hi-fi, and good enough sound. A younger generation of listeners entering the market did not want to sit motionless in a chair, evaluating the exact placement of a vocalist within a stereo image. They were buying DVD players. They were transforming their sitting rooms into home cinemas. For the cost of a single pair of British-made Rogers LS 3/5A monitors, a consumer could walk into a high-street retailer and purchase an entire bundled surround sound system from massive Japanese or Korean electronics giants. These imported systems included an AV receiver, 5 small plastic satellite speakers, and a powered subwoofer. The cheaper speaker did not need to sound honest. It did not need to reproduce the complex harmonics of a cello perfectly. It only needed to sound loud enough to deliver a cinematic explosion. Furthermore, Rogers was caught in a trap of its own historical prestige. To compete with the rising tide of budget imports and massive volume brands, the Woki Hong Group attempted to leverage the Rogers name in the entry-level market. They introduced new, cheaper loudspeaker lines manufactured outside the United Kingdom to capitalize on the famous heritage. But this strategy alienated the very people who had built the brand. British specialist hi-fi dealers were highly protective of their listening rooms and their reputations. When a dealer saw the Rogers badge on a product that compromised the legendary acoustic truth for a cheaper retail price point, they felt the promise had been broken. Shops that had proudly demonstrated the LS7 or the Studio One quietly removed the brand from their shelves. They surrendered the demonstration space to competitors like Bowers and Wilkins, or KEF, who had managed the transition to overseas manufacturing more carefully while fiercely protecting their high-end reference lines. Without the specialist dealers to explain the heritage, Rogers became just another wooden box on a crowded retail floor. Then, the physical raw materials of the BBC legacy vanished. KEF, the Maidstone-based manufacturer that supplied the critical B110 bass driver and T27 tweeter, faced its own corporate transformations. KEF eventually ceased production of those specific, aging drivers. Without the KEF components, a true BBC-licensed LS 3/5A could no longer be built. The fundamental acoustic recipe that had defined the company for over 2 decades was completely gone. The final British chapter arrived in the autumn of 1998. The parent company concluded that manufacturing traditional, heavily engineered wooden loudspeaker cabinets in South London was entirely incompatible with the profit margins of modern global electronics retail. The Mitcham factory at 310 Commonside East was permanently closed. The production lines were dismantled. The skilled cabinet makers, the technicians who had spent decades hand-soldering massive crossover boards, and the acoustic engineers who tested every single unit against the strict broadcast standard were let go. The physical infrastructure of the greatest British broadcast-derived speaker tradition was swept away. The physical company was dead, but Force 4 ensured the trademark survived. Stripped of its British manufacturing base, stripped of its BBC license, and stripped of its acoustic philosophy, the Rogers name suffered absolute brand dilution. The famous logo, a mark that once guaranteed absolute broadcast truth in London studios, began appearing on cheap audio equipment sold across Asia. It appeared on mass-market surround sound packages. It appeared on budget car audio drivers. It appeared on karaoke amplifiers. It appeared on generic plastic products the original engineers in Surrey would not even recognize as hi-fi. The prestige of the British monitor was aggressively harvested to sell volume. The long decline was complete. The market changed the rules. The BBC moved on. The specialist dealers dropped the line. The KEF drivers stopped. The London factory closed. The Mitcham doors locked. The cabinet makers went home. The crossover boards disappeared. The wood veneer vanished. The plastic speakers arrived. The famous badge moved overseas. The listening room went dark. The story of Rogers did not end in the cheap electronics markets of the Far East. For a time, it seemed the legacy of the Mitcham factory had been entirely extinguished, replaced by a cynical exercise in brand harvesting that placed a legendary name on profoundly inferior products. However, in recent years, a remarkable British resurrection occurred. The Rogers brand returned to the United Kingdom. Driven by a deep respect for the broadcast heritage, the revived company began working closely with renowned British audio designers, most notably Andy Whittle, a man intimately familiar with the original BBC engineering philosophy and the strict parameters of the broadcast license. Their goal was not to launch another modern mass-market wireless speaker. It was to meticulously recreate the classic Rogers LS 3/5A and the larger LS 5/9 monitors to the exact original BBC specifications. Today, these iconic monitors are once again manufactured in Britain. They are built in small, painstaking batches, using heavily researched materials, precise crossover networks, and the highest grade of birch plywood available. They are sold not to high-street electronics chains, but to a highly dedicated specialist audiophile market that remembers exactly what the Rogers badge was always supposed to mean. The original acoustic philosophy survived the corporate dilution. But the true survival of the Rogers name did not depend solely on this boutique new production. Long before the brand was officially resurrected, it was kept alive by a massive, fiercely dedicated British preservation and enthusiast community. The secondary market for vintage Rogers equipment is nothing short of extraordinary. On platforms like eBay and Gumtree, and within specialist vintage audio forums such as Pinkfish Media and Hi-Fi Wigwam, an original 15-ohm pair of Rogers LS 3/5A monitors is treated with absolute reverence. Collectors in Britain, alongside an incredibly passionate community in Japan, chase these small wooden cabinets relentlessly. They will pay thousands of pounds sterling for a pristine pair from the late 1970s. specialist repairers spend hours carefully restoring the complex crossover boards, hunting down identical vintage capacitors to keep the original voicing completely intact. Refoaming services keep the aging Kiev bass drivers moving freely within their sealed boxes. Retired hi-fi dealers and former Mitchum factory workers share archival knowledge online, confirming serial numbers, identifying production variations, and providing the historical context to ensure the heritage is properly preserved. They do not view these objects as obsolete electronics. They view them as historical acoustic instruments that require curatorial care. And there is a very specific, highly functional reason why this massive effort is undertaken, why the original still matters. An old British loudspeaker with a solid, heavily damped wooden cabinet, a beautifully engineered crossover, and a carefully restored bass driver can still do what a modern, plastic wireless speaker simply cannot. It can make a recording feel physically anchored in the room. It can reproduce the human voice with an astonishing honesty and dynamic realism that modern digital processing often fails to replicate. Not because the speaker is old, but because sound still begins where air moves. The absolute truth of a broadcast standard, built to reveal acoustic flaws rather than hide them, does not expire with age or technological fashion. Yet, the geography that built this truth has changed completely. If a vintage audio enthusiast travels to 310 Common Side East in Mitcham today, looking for the greatest broadcast-derived speaker factory in Britain, they will not find it. The heavy industrial noise has vanished. The site where Swisstone built tens of thousands of BBC monitors has been completely redeveloped. It is now a mixed-use residential and commercial space, part of a modern housing development known as Windmill Park. Families live in flats exactly where the cabinet makers once glued and pressed real wood veneers. A ground-floor retail unit sits on the very ground where thousands of Kiev drivers were once rigorously measured, tested, and often rejected for failing to meet the broadcast curve. There is no visible manufacturing left. There is no blue plaque to mark the location where the definitive voice of the British Broadcasting Corporation was built. The landscape has simply absorbed the history and moved on. But there is a surprise footnote to the Rogers story that defies this physical erasure. Somewhere deep inside the BBC's own extensive archives and in highly secretive, private mastering rooms across the world, original pairs of Rogers LS3/5A monitors remain firmly bolted to heavy studio consoles. They have never been modified. They have never been replaced by modern, active monitors. Decades after the Mitchum factory was dismantled, serious recording engineers still switch over to these specific 40-year-old wooden boxes to check the final vocal mix, trusting an aging piece of British hi-fi history over modern digital algorithms. The story of Rogers is the story of the fundamental tension between acoustic engineering and mass commerce. It reveals a country capable of building the most accurate, relentlessly tested acoustic instruments in the world, only to discover that the global retail market often prefers cheap convenience, explosive volume, and wireless connectivity over genuine acoustic truth. It shows how easily a legendary engineering reputation can be diluted when an intellectual property asset is separated from its physical workshop and sold to the highest bidder. But it also proves that true acoustic honesty, once built and placed into a room, cannot be entirely erased by corporate consolidation. Somewhere today, a pair of original Rogers LS3/5A monitors is still standing in the corner of a British sitting room, its black Tigan grill cloth perfectly intact, waiting for an amplifier, a turntable, and one more record. See you in the next one.